senatorial candidate Rand Paul has officially resurfaced, making his first public appearance since his post-election streak of honesty followed by retraction. He's quoting Charles Dickens in describing the last week. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Our third story tonight, Dr. Paul's Democratic opponent for that Senate seat, Kentucky's Attorney General Jack Conway, joins us next. Dr. Paul chose a local Lions club in Bowling Green, Kentucky for his return to the public stage, if you would call that public. He had just performed eye surgery, apparently didn't get a chance to change. And after the past week, he'd probably prefer to focus on the present, telling the group that he does not want to repeal the Civil Rights Act. The recurring problem is that Paul's prior comments do not come off as slips of the tongue, but rather as the real Paul. As bluntly expressed today by Gene Robinson in the Washington Post, Rand Paul can't abruptly disavow the extremist views on civil rights that he's been espousing for years and expect us all to just move along. Was he lying then? Is he lying now? Was he being untruthful on the occasions when he said the federal government has no authority to outlaw racial discrimination in private businesses such as restaurants? Dr. Paul's own words created the issue. Recall his online interview with the editorial board of Louisville's Courier-Journal. Dr. Paul said, quote, "I don't like the idea of telling private business owners I abhor racism. I think it's a bad business decision to ever exclude anybody from your restaurant. But at the same time, I do believe in private ownership." And later in the same interview, questioner, but under your philosophy, it would be okay for Dr. King to not be served at the counter at Woolworths? Answer, I would not go to that Woolworths. And I would stand up in my community and say it's abhorrent. In a free society, we will tolerate boorish people who have abhorrent behavior. But if we're civilized people, we publicly criticize that and don't belong to those groups or associate with those people. Let's bring in, as promised, the Attorney General of the state of Kentucky and a Democratic nominee for the Senate from that state, Jack Conway. Great, thanks for your time tonight, sir.
My pleasure, Keith. It's good to be with you.
Dr. Paul believes his stance on Civil Rights Act and what to do with it has been settled. Do you agree with that?
No, absolutely not, Keith. Rand Paul wants to be a Washington outsider. But on this issue, he's pulled the good old Washington flip-flop. I mean, what it's clear that Rand Paul stands for is rejecting a fundamental provision of the Civil Rights Act that basically dealt with lunch counters and said you can't put a whites-only sign in your window. And then in 20 of the most painful minutes I've ever seen on cable TV, Rachel Maddow was just grilling him and grilling him and grilling him. And he said that had he been around in 1964 and in the United States Senate, he would have been trying to modify that provision that dealt with private accommodations. It's clear to me that he rejects a fundamental provision of the Civil Rights Act, and now some people are wanting to say, oh, you know, Jack, this is your problem. No, Rand, it's your problem. You started talking about this weeks ago. You talked about it to NPR. You've talked about it to Rachel Maddow. And he's on record with about 40 minutes of tape regarding where he stands on civil rights.
Well, there was the letter to the editor in 2002. This is not like this just came up. It wasn't somebody picked, Rachel certainly didn't, and nor did NPR, picked a topic out of the hat and hoped to get him on something. And it's not just, they've tried to couch this in terms of philosophy, but if you're going to go and place property rights and the rights of an owner to do whatever he feels like ahead of civil rights and civic good, does that not necessarily lead to various positions that would directly affect public policy?
Oh, absolutely, Keith. You know, we have an old country saying in Kentucky that your rights end at the tip of my nose. And Rand Paul doesn't really seem to understand that. But it's not just civil rights. It's what he said about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Look at what he said on Good Morning America about BP, that the administration needs to get its boot heel off of the neck of BP. Good grief. I mean, BP needs to get its boot heel off the neck of fishermen along the Gulf Coast. The problem is Rand Paul has this worldview. He has this worldview that government should never interfere whatsoever with business. And he's on record saying he wants to repeal OSHA regulations. There seems to be no area where Rand Paul thinks the government should intrude. And he wants to traipse around and talk about ending bailouts and taking your country back. Well, you know what? We need more accountability on Wall Street with the banks that caused this problem in the first place. We need more accountability for energy giants like BP, not less of it. So his rhetoric doesn't really match what I think working families in Kentucky need. And he seems to want to be the prince of some out of the mainstream movement. I just want to be the next senator from Kentucky.
To that point, do you worry, and I understand this is far more the responsibility of people like me, that this race will become all about Rand Paul and less about you and really less about the issues that supposedly are at the heart of any senatorial race in any state?
Well, I think there's just such a sharp contrast here that I hope your viewers will go to our website, go to jackconway.org, check out my positions on a hometown tax credit and what I would do to try to create jobs, because I really believe that's the #1 issue in a state like Kentucky with nearly 11% unemployment. Check out our plan to get small and community banks lending to small and medium-sized businesses again. There's a real difference between us on the issues, and yes, it's obviously about Rand Paul. A lot of people are just referring to me as Rand Paul's opponent. I think I can stand on my own right now. Charlie Cook declared this race a toss-up today. We're going to beat him. We can't afford to have this guy in the United States Senate. Kentucky can't afford it. The nation can't afford it. You know, I'm fiscally responsible in certain areas. I want a government we can afford, but this country cannot afford Rand Paul.
We have a story coming up about the Republican Party in North Carolina describing one of the candidates seeking its own congressional nomination, the Republican nomination. The chairman of that party says he's unfit for public office at any level. Do you feel that strongly about Dr. Paul? In your opinion, is he unqualified to be the senator from Kentucky?
Well, I'm going to let the voters of my beloved Commonwealth of Kentucky judge that. You know, I have some pretty strong feelings about that. Kentucky's come a long way as a state. You know, we were the first state to establish south of the Mason-Dixon line to establish a civil rights commission. Kentuckians are a proud people, and I think we're a little embarrassed by some of the things that he has said, and he's going to have to answer for himself on that. You had one of George Bush's policy advisors coming out today saying that Reverend Dobson and Sarah Palin need to distance themselves from Rand Paul. So I'm going to leave others to address that issue, and I'm just going to run as best I can to try to be the next senator from Kentucky.
I think a lot of other people will, in fact, address that issue. Jack Conway, the Attorney General of Kentucky and the Democratic candidate for the Senate from the Commonwealth. Great thanks again for your time, sir.
My pleasure, Keith.